This case starts in Hendersonville, Tennessee, a city just outside Nashville. On the surface, it looks like a quiet suburban community. Families live in neighborhoods with tree-lined streets, kids go to school, and most days are pretty ordinary. But in February 2024, something happened there that would turn into one of the most talked-about missing person cases in the country. The person at the center of the mystery was 15-year-old Sebastian Rogers. Sebastian was described as a teenager who loved video games and building things. He was also autistic. The people who knew him said he had his own routines and interests, like a lot of teenagers do. Nothing about him suggested that he was about to become the focus of a nationwide search effort. Then, sometime during the night of February 25 and the early morning hours of February 26, Sebastian disappeared. According to the information released by investigators, Sebastian was last known to be at home. When his family realized he was gone, they reported him missing. Very quickly, what seemed like a local missing person case became something much bigger. Law enforcement agencies began searching the area around the family's home. Volunteers joined in. Search teams combed through woods, fields, neighborhoods, and nearby properties. Drones were used. K-9 units were brought in. Investigators followed tips and leads as they came in. At first, many people assumed there would be a quick answer. Maybe Sebastian had wandered away and would be found nearby. Maybe he had gone somewhere familiar and would return on his own. Maybe there was a simple explanation that nobody had thought of yet. But as hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks, no confirmed trace of Sebastian was found. That was the first thing that made this case so unusual. In many missing person investigations, searchers eventually discover something that points them in a direction. A sighting, a piece of clothing, a personal item, security camera footage, some kind of clue. In Sebastian's case, investigators searched extensively, yet the public was given very little evidence that clearly explained where he went. As the search expanded, national attention followed. News organizations began covering the case. Social media users started sharing theories. True crime communities discussed every detail that became public. Thousands of people who had never met Sebastian suddenly wanted answers. At the center of everything was one simple question. How does a 15-year-old boy disappear from his home and leave behind so few clear clues? Quick pause before we continue. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, let me know your country in the comments. I love seeing where these cases reach. And if you're interested in real criminal cases, unsolved mysteries, and in-depth investigations, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you don't miss future documentaries. Investigators worked to establish a timeline. Based on public statements from authorities, Sebastian was believed to have been at home during the evening before he disappeared. At some point during the night, something happened. The problem was that nobody could say with certainty exactly what that something was. The hours between the last confirmed sighting and the discovery that he was missing became the most important part of the investigation. Every detail mattered. Who was awake? Who was asleep? What sounds were heard? What doors were opened? What electronic devices were used? What cameras might have captured movement? Investigators examined these questions carefully, because missing person cases often depend on the smallest pieces of information. Meanwhile, search efforts continued on a massive scale. Volunteers traveled from different areas to help. Law enforcement agencies coordinated resources. Search teams spent long hours covering difficult terrain. Yet despite the effort, the mystery remained. As public interest grew, another challenge appeared: the internet. People began analyzing every interview, every public statement, and every news report. Some focused on comments made by family members. Others questioned timelines. Certain theories gained popularity online even when there was little evidence to support them. This created a difficult situation. The amount of discussion surrounding the case increased dramatically, but discussion is not the same thing as evidence. Investigators had to separate rumors from facts while continuing their search for Sebastian. Months passed. Then more months passed. The case remained active, but there was still no confirmed answer. For many observers, that became one of the most unsettling parts of the story. Usually, Time reveals something. Witnesses come forward. Evidence appears. Mistakes are uncovered. New information changes the direction of an investigation. But in Sebastian's case, the central mystery remained largely unchanged. A teenager had vanished. Extensive searches had been conducted. National attention had been focused on the case. And yet the most important question still had no clear answer. Where was Sebastian Rogers? As investigators continued to follow leads, people studying the case began looking closely at the different possibilities. Some believed the answer could be found somewhere within the search area itself. Others wondered whether Sebastian had traveled farther than anyone initially expected. Each possibility came with its own questions. Each possibility also came with problems. And as the investigation moved forward, those unanswered questions would become the focus of intense public debate. As the weeks went on, investigators kept searching for anything that could explain what happened. This wasn't a small search. Authorities brought in multiple agencies. Search and rescue teams spent countless hours covering land around Hendersonville and nearby areas. Volunteers showed up wanting to help. Drones flew over wooded areas. K-9 teams worked through difficult terrain. Tips came in from across the country. Still, no confirmed sign of Sebastian was found. That alone made people pay attention to the case. Searches of this size often uncover at least something. A piece of clothing, a backpack, footprints, a confirmed sighting. Some clue that points investigators in a direction. But the longer the search continued, the more unusual the situation seemed. Authorities repeatedly stated that they were following leads and examining evidence, but very little specific information was released publicly. That left a lot of room for speculation. People wanted to understand what happened during the hours before Sebastian disappeared. According to publicly available information, Sebastian had been at home on the evening before he was reported missing. Investigators worked to piece together what occurred overnight and during the early morning hours. In any missing person case, those final known hours are critical. Investigators typically try to answer a series of basic questions. What was the person's state of mind? Were there any unusual events beforehand? Did anyone notice strange behavior? Was there any communication with friends or family? Did surveillance cameras capture anything important? Were electronic devices active during the relevant time period? In Sebastian's case, many of those answers either weren't publicly known or remained unclear. As a result, the mystery only grew. At the same time, public attention began creating its own challenges. True crime communities online became heavily involved in discussing the case. Social media platforms filled with theories. Videos analyzing the disappearance received thousands of views. Every interview was examined. Every public statement was dissected. Some people believed there had to be a simple explanation. Others believed something much more serious had happened. The problem was that very few people outside the investigation had access to the actual evidence. As often happens in high-profile missing person cases, facts and speculation started mixing together. One theory focused on the possibility that Sebastian left the house on his own. Supporters of this idea pointed out that teenagers sometimes leave unexpectedly for reasons that aren't immediately obvious to family members. Investigators always consider this possibility in missing person cases. But this explanation raised questions. If Sebastian left voluntarily, where did he go? How far could he have traveled? Why had nobody reported a confirmed sighting? And why had such extensive searches failed to uncover any evidence of his movements? Another possibility was that Sebastian became lost after leaving home. Search teams examined areas where someone might have wandered and become disoriented. This possibility received attention because investigators had conducted large searches in surrounding areas. Yet as time passed, this explanation also became more difficult for some observers to accept. Search efforts had been extensive. The terrain had been examined repeatedly. Resources had been committed on a significant scale. Still, there was no confirmed discovery that explained his disappearance. Then there were theories suggesting that another person may have been involved. This possibility often emerges in missing person investigations, especially when there is little physical evidence available to explain what happened. Authorities have never publicly announced definitive evidence supporting such a conclusion. However, investigators also continued treating the case seriously and actively pursuing leads. That careful approach left many questions open. One of the reasons the case attracted so much attention was because every explanation seemed to run into obstacles. If Sebastian left voluntarily, there appeared to be very little evidence showing where he went. If he became lost, searchers had not located him despite extensive efforts. If another person was involved, investigators had not publicly revealed evidence proving that scenario either. The result was a mystery that seemed stuck between possibilities. As months passed, law enforcement agencies continued encouraging the public to come forward with information. Tips were reviewed and investigated. Potential sightings were examined. Leads were followed. The FBI also became involved in assisting the investigation. Whenever federal resources become involved in a missing person case, public attention tends to increase. Many people interpreted this as a sign that authorities remained committed to finding answers. Despite that commitment, the passage of time created another challenge. Memories fade. Witnesses become harder to locate. Potential evidence can disappear. Investigators know that the first days and weeks of a case are often the most important. Yet there are also cases where breakthroughs happen years later because somebody finally decides to speak, a forgotten detail resurfaces, or technology reveals something that wasn't previously visible. For Sebastian's family, every day without answers added another layer of uncertainty. Unlike cases where investigators eventually confirm what happened, this investigation remained suspended between hope and mystery. There was no definitive conclusion, no confirmed location, no publicly known explanation that tied all the facts together. And because there were so few clear answers, public scrutiny intensified. Interviews given by people connected to the case became subjects of debate online. Body language was analyzed. Statements were compared against previous comments. Entire communities formed around discussing what might have happened. Some observers believed certain details were being misunderstood. Others believed important clues were hidden within public statements. The challenge, however, was that most of these discussions were based on limited information. Investigators often possess evidence that is never released publicly. They may withhold details to protect the integrity of an active investigation. They may avoid discussing certain findings because doing so could interfere with future leads. As a result, people outside the investigation were trying to solve a puzzle without seeing all of the pieces. What remained undeniable was the central fact. A 15-year-old boy had disappeared. Extensive searches had followed. National attention had focused on the case. Years later, there was still no confirmed explanation for what happened. That reality kept the case alive. Every new tip generated interest. Every public update renewed discussion. Every anniversary of Sebastian's disappearance brought the story back into the spotlight. And for investigators, the most important question remained exactly where it had been from the beginning. Somewhere between the last normal evening at home and the moment his absence was discovered, Sebastian Rogers vanished. What happened during those missing hours remains the key to understanding the entire case. And until those hours can be fully explained, the mystery continues. As the investigation continued into its second year, one thing became increasingly clear. The disappearance of Sebastian Rogers was no longer just a local missing person case. It had become a national mystery. By this point, countless hours had been spent searching, investigating, reviewing evidence, and following leads. Law enforcement agencies continued to stress that the case remained active. They encouraged anyone with information, no matter how small it seemed, to come forward. The FBI also continued assisting in the search for answers. Public appeals were issued. Reward money was offered in hopes that someone, somewhere, knew something important and would finally speak up. Yet despite all of that attention, the central mystery remained exactly the same. Nobody could publicly explain where Sebastian had gone. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was that there appeared to be no single theory that answered every question. Each possibility seemed to explain some details while leaving others unresolved. If Sebastian left the house on his own, investigators would still need to determine where he went, and why no confirmed evidence of his movements had emerged afterward. If he became lost somewhere in the surrounding area, search teams would still need to explain why such extensive efforts failed to locate him. If another person was involved, investigators would still need evidence that clearly established what happened and who was responsible. Every path seemed to lead to another unanswered question. That is one reason the case continues to attract so much public interest. People are naturally drawn to mysteries. But this case is different from many others because it appears to begin with a simple situation. A teenager is at home. The next day, he is gone. There are no obvious signs pointing to a clear explanation, and that simplicity makes the mystery feel even more difficult to understand. Over time, online discussions became increasingly intense. Some people focused on investigative details. Others concentrated on family dynamics. Some examined maps, timelines, and search locations. Others looked for inconsistencies in interviews or public statements. But despite years of analysis by thousands of people, nobody has been able to produce evidence that definitively explains Sebastian's disappearance. That is an important distinction. There have been many theories. There have been many opinions. There have been many debates. But theories are not answers. Investigators work with evidence, and evidence remains the foundation of any real solution. In cases like this, there is often a temptation to assume that the absence of information means something is being hidden. However, investigators frequently keep details private for practical reasons. Information may be withheld because it helps verify future tips. Certain facts may only be known by investigators and whoever was involved. If those details become public too early, it can make it harder to separate genuine information from false leads. Because of that, it remains possible that law enforcement knows more than has been publicly released. At the same time, it is also possible that investigators are still searching for the crucial piece of information that will finally explain what happened. History has shown that some missing person cases are solved years or even decades after the disappearance. Sometimes a witness comes forward. Sometimes new technology reveals overlooked evidence. Sometimes a person decides they can no longer keep a secret. And sometimes a single detail changes everything. For now, however, Sebastian's case remains unsolved. The home where he was last known to be, the overnight hours before he vanished, the searches that followed, the countless tips reviewed by investigators. All of these pieces remain part of a puzzle that has yet to be completed. What makes the story especially difficult is that behind every headline and every theory is a real person. Sebastian was not simply a mystery. He was a teenager with interests, routines, and people who cared about him. Every passing month without answers affects those who continue waiting for news. That human reality is often lost when cases become the subject of widespread online discussion, yet it remains the most important part of the story. Somewhere, there is an answer, whether it lies in a forgotten observation, an overlooked detail, a future witness statement, or evidence that has not yet been discovered. The truth exists. The challenge is finding it. As of today, the official search for answers continues. Investigators still seek information. The FBI continues to encourage tips. Rewards remain available for information that could help move the case forward. And the question that first emerged in February 2024 still hangs over the entire investigation. What happened to Sebastian Rogers? Was there something important hidden within those final hours at home? Did someone see something they did not realize was significant? Is there a piece of evidence waiting to be discovered? Or does the answer already exist somewhere, known only to a person who has never come forward? For now, nobody knows. The streets of Hendersonville continue with their normal routines. Cars pass through neighborhoods. Families go about their daily lives. Time moves forward, as it always does. But one mystery remains frozen in place. A 15-year-old boy disappeared. Years later, no confirmed explanation has emerged. No definitive answer has been provided. And until that answer is found, the case of Sebastian Rogers remains one of the most haunting and perplexing missing person investigations in recent American history. Somewhere between an ordinary evening and the following morning, a teenager vanished. The search continues, and so does the question, where is Sebastian Rogers? Up next are two more real cases waiting for you. If this investigation captured your attention, tap 1 and keep watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for future documentaries. And before you go, tell me your city in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where viewers are watching from.